On this calm Sunday afternoon, I decided to see a nasty, disgusting, depraved, horrific movie called X. Happy weekend. Welcome to yet another episode of Round the Clock Frights. I am Josh, and today I'm going to be talking about an A24 horror film called X. But real quick, guys, I have a really exciting update. So for the past couple of months, I have been working on a short film. I came up with a concept, and I've been directing a horror short. And we only have one more day of filming left, but I was able to put a teaser trailer together. The film is about a jaded online gamer who gets invited to play an indie horror game and accidentally brings something evil into the real world. I am really excited to finish this film. It's been a lot of hard work, but in the words of Spike Lee, filmmaking is tough shit. But I'm excited to get it out there. I'm going to go ahead and leave a link to the teaser trailer down below. You can check that out for our short film, Out of the Grid. Now, let's talk about the movie X. So, interesting thing. Before 2022 started, I would say in December, I was looking at a list of upcoming horror movies, specifically horror movies for this year, and, you had the typical titles like Scream, Halloween Ends, all that stuff, the big studio titles, but there wasn't really much in the way of indie horror that captured my interest, and I don't remember seeing, any advertisements for this movie. And Ty West is a very prolific filmmaker. I mean, Ty West has gained a lot of respect in the horror community, and if I had known about this movie, I would have been much more excited about it, because for one, Ty West, he is a very intriguing filmmaker. He's made some very critically acclaimed movies like House of the Devil, The Innkeepers, and The Sacrament, a found footage flick, and if you actually look at the Rotten Tomatoes scores for his movies, general audiences don't tend to appreciate them very much. I think pretty much every movie he's directed has a rotten audience score on Rotten Tomatoes, and he does have a specific style, which we'll get into later, which doesn't appeal to everyone, but I like his work. I think, like I said, he's a very intriguing filmmaker, and here's the thing. Not only is he an intriguing filmmaker, but he understands atmosphere. His horror films are so atmospheric and just, they're all about the build-up. His films have some terrific build-up in them. So the plot of X, it's about this colorful band of adult filmmakers who go out into the middle of Texas. Yes, Texas. I believe another famous horror movie was filmed in Texas. It kind of escapes me at the moment, but I mean, Texas is a pretty scary place, so it is appropriate to set a horror movie there. Anyway, they go out to the middle of this farmhouse, which is owned by this creepy elderly couple, and they promise to be discreet. They're hiding the fact that they're making a porno, and let's just say that creepy shenanigans ensue, and this elderly couple has a lust for murder, specifically when it comes to young, attractive people. And honestly, that's all I'm going to say about the plot in general, because I want to get into this movie's development of its characters. So the difference between something like this and, let's say, 2022's Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which was just a stinky pile of poo, this movie does have some pretty decent character development. Like, each of these characters have their own unique, distinct personalities, and, in Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2022, in my review for that movie, I bring up how all the characters are just pretentious, annoying, unlikable pieces of human filth, and I couldn't stand to watch any of them. In this film, none of these adult filmmakers are particularly likable, but here's the difference. You could tell that Ty West still had an affection for these characters, and even though they're not likable, their connection to each other does feel very genuine. The cast members of this movie, they have some terrific chemistry, and you believe that they've been working together for a long time. They feel like a close-knit family, and it reminds me of Paul Thomas Anderson's Boogie Nights. Boogie Nights is also about a group of people wanting to make, these artistic adult films, and, they're a bunch of sleazeballs, but Paul Thomas Anderson still treated his characters with respect, and the reason we grew to like them was because they felt very human, and, again, their connections to one another, they felt very close, and you could tell that they've been friends for a long time. So that's the difference. And this could have been another horror film where, you have all these unlikable characters that you just want to see get murdered in the most horrific, grisly ways, but to be honest, I did feel somewhat of an attachment to some of these characters. Particularly to Jenna Ortega and Mia Goth. Both were terrific in this movie. So, it also comes down to the writing. There's a scene where, the characters are just sitting in the room, and, you have Kid Cudi. Yeah, Kid Cudi. He is actually pretty decent in this movie. He has a guitar, and he plays a cover of the song Landslide. And it's a very, touching moment, and, before that happens, all these characters are talking about how, they've been able to live freely for the past few years. They live, outside the norms of society, and they just feel so free. And it's a wonderful moment, and it makes you understand these characters, and, while we may not agree with their approach to certain things, we can understand, where they're coming from. And that just makes all the difference in the world when it comes to creating characters that you can at least root for, even if they're not particularly likable. So, A24, when it comes to their horror movies tend to be very slow and atmospheric. Something like Hereditary, that movie moved at a snail's pace, but it felt like a fuse had been lit. You had this slow-burning fuse that eventually was going to lead to an enormous explosion, and in Hereditary, man, it certainly did, because the climax of that movie is entertaining, exciting, gruesome as hell, and it did make the wait worth it. Another good example is The Witch. The Witch is a bit of a slow burn, but it was incredibly atmospheric and well shot, and the ending was rather unsettling. This movie is a slow burn, but I think general audiences might like it a little bit more, because when it does become an all-out horror movie, it does have some, gory highlights. There are some very effective kill sequences, and I mentioned earlier how Ty West is very good at build-up. The build-up to these kill sequences, man, the build-up is like so good. Even though I do have this to say, none of the kills are particularly creative. In fact, this is when it becomes a bit more like a typical slasher, because the kills aren't very creative. In fact, we've seen kills like these in many, many other slasher films. There is, however, one particularly gruesome highlight, and let me just say this. If you're familiar with my channel, you'll know that I have a deeply rooted fear of a certain reptilian creature, a creature that can often be found in swamps, and let's just say that there's a kill sequence in this movie involving a certain reptilian creature that made me tremble, and, just made me feel like I was going to, have an emotional breakdown. That kill, that kill scene definitely got me. I'll just say that. Okay, so get your negative comments ready, guys. Get your guns ready, because I'm about to unveil one of my more unpopular opinions. I've never thought that Ty West was very good at concluding his films, even though I know I'm in the minority on that. Like I mentioned earlier, he's all about the build-up. In something like House of the Devil, you have a character who spends the majority of the film by herself, and to be honest, I enjoyed spending, that time with her. When it was just her on screen. You have this character who is looking after this house, and it's mostly her. And by the end of the movie, we get this, shit hits the fan. We get this obnoxiously edited, over-the-top MTV-style conclusion that just felt very rushed and didn't match the rest of the movie. And I understand that can be considered, an exciting payoff, but to me it just wasn't. It felt rushed, and, the same with something like The Sacrament. The Sacrament, that movie was very effective. It was about these characters who go to this commune in the middle of nowhere, and, it's a very Jim Jones situation where you have this cult leader who has brainwashed these individuals, and, let's just say that they drank the Kool-Aid at the end, and the payoff just felt underwhelming in that film as well. Like, it just felt typical and predictable, even though I liked The Sacrament, for the most part, and I also liked the House of the Devil for the most part. I don't know, just Ty West, for me, the first halves of his films are often much more engaging, because that's when we get to spend more time with his characters, and in this film it's no different. I actually became very very emotionally invested in these characters for the first half of the movie, and then when it becomes an all-out horror film, that's when things started to feel a little bit more typical, a little bit more predictable. Characters would do typical stupid horror movie shit where they would go into dark houses by themselves, they would go into empty barns by themselves, and it started to lose my interest a little bit, I'm not gonna lie. But here is what elevates it. And okay, real quick. The term elevated horror tends to be thrown around a lot these days, and I've always hated that term. It has always felt very snobby and condescending. Excuse me, my voice just cracked. I'm like a 13-year-old boy. Elevated horror is a very condescending term. Because,
audiences, they don't, they shouldn't like films like Scream or, Halloween Kills because those are studio fare. They should watch real art, real elevated horror like The Witch or Hereditary or It Comes at Night.
I've always hated that viewpoint. Popular entertainment does have its place, and, we don't need to feast on extravagant food all the time. Sometimes we enjoy our, junk food. And in my opinion, there's nothing wrong with that. So I hate the term elevated horror. And honestly, it all comes down to the filmmaker. A24, they hired Ty West, and he's a very talented filmmaker. So if a studio is willing to give a director, free reign to make whatever he or she wants, then a good amount of the time, it will probably result in something good. It doesn't always happen that way. But, last year, James Wan, a very celebrated filmmaker, released *Malignant*, which a lot of audiences didn't necessarily like, but the studio let him do what he wanted, and I found *Malignant* to be a rather fascinating film. So it all comes down to the filmmaker. Elevated horror, fuck that shit. I mean, a movie like, 2022 Scream can be just as elevated as something like Hereditary if it's done with the right amount of passion and talent. I'm gonna let you guys in on a little secret, okay? Just come here, just come a little bit closer. Just lend me your ears, ladies and gentlemen. Violence in cinema can be art. Let me stress that again. Violence in cinema can be art. Filmmakers like Quentin Tarantino understand that. There just has to be an artistic reasoning for that violence. It's something Roger Ebert said many times, throughout his illustrious career. Violence has its place in cinema, and X does have some gory scenes. It does. It has scenes that will make you feel very, very uncomfortable and icky, but it also has some very potent themes. Obsession with youth, the fear of getting older, the fear of not making a difference in the world, the fear of being forgotten one day. These are themes that elevate it. I'm not saying that it's elevated horror, but these themes, make it more than just your typical slasher film, because there are some very, very clever parallels between the elderly couple and the adult filmmakers. There are multiple scenes where, you'll have the two groups of characters in completely different places, and the film will often cut back and forth between them, and the action will often be very similar. There's a scene where Mia Goth is sitting at a kitchen table, and the older woman is offering her a glass of lemonade, and at the same time, the adult filmmakers are filming a sequence in which the characters are drinking lemonade at a table. So this film does have some very clever things going on, in regards to its storytelling. I don't know if general audiences are going to pick up on those themes necessarily, but we'll see. This movie does have a surprisingly high-ish audience score. The last time I looked, it was close to 80%, so like I mentioned earlier, general audiences might take to this film a bit more than they have with other A24 horror films or other
elevated horror films.
And here's another thing that I appreciated about this movie. This movie is more of an homage to the spirit of old-time Grindhouse films because, let's look at 2007's Grindhouse. I mean, cute, but, they did the thing where they wanted to make it look like an actual 70s Grindhouse film. They added a lot of grain to the scenes, and they made the footage just look disgusting and dirty. And this film, the cinematography is very, very clean, very polished, and it's much more of an homage to the spirit of those films. He doesn't add any unnecessary grain, to the film, and I appreciated that because honestly, I've never been a big fan of that shit. You know, when filmmakers intentionally make their films look grungy, they add a filter in Final Cut Pro or Adobe Premiere or whatever editing system that they use. So, this film cinematography was less annoying than something like, I can't even think of a good example, but I liked that this film was actually good looking. The cinematography was actually breathtaking in many, many sequences. So, my overall thoughts on X, I'm going to say it's above average. I would have appreciated it a bit more if the payoff was more satisfying. To me, it just wasn't, at least not entirely. The payoff was a little underwhelming, and it's a problem I've had with other Ty West movies. I know that's an unpopular opinion on my part, but that's just how I feel, guys. Critics have praised Ty West for having exciting conclusions. They just haven't always worked for me. But yeah, this film is going to be rather divisive. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. And I do appreciate the fact that this film is getting a mainstream release, because there were scenes in this movie that, my god, would be so uncomfortable to watch with a packed theater. There were a few parties at my theater, but it wasn't a packed theater, but there were some sequences that were a bit uncomfortable to watch, especially among a group of complete strangers. And this movie will often make you feel uncomfortable, let's just say that. But yes, guys, those are my overall thoughts on Ty West's X. As far as where I would rank it among other A24 horror films, personally, I liked it a bit more than The Lighthouse, more than Green Room, 2016's The Monster, directed by Brian Bertino, I believe his name is. Definitely worth it, definitely worth seeing it. If you're a horror fan, if you're a fan of 70s grindhouse films, go out to your local theater to see it. Again, something like this is playing in theaters, and that in and of itself is a rather amazing fact. But yes, guys, thank you so much for joining me in my discussion of Ty West's X. Again, I would love to have your support in regards to the short film that we've been making. We've been putting a lot of work into it. We have a couple of very exciting sequences. There was a location, actually, that I was able to film at, and I was very, very grateful to have been given permission to film there. But yes, please check out the link for the teaser trailer of our horror short, Out of the Grid. And again, guys, thank you so much. If you have any suggestions as far as what we should tackle next, please leave them down below. 2022 is just getting started. We're not even at the halfway point, so there's still much more to come. And yeah, if you're looking for a good film to watch X with, I would definitely pair this with Boogie Nights. Just movies about making movies. I often enjoy those. But again, guys, thank you so much again for joining me. Have a very scary day, boils and ghouls, and take care, and X gonna give it to you. I've been waiting to make that joke all night. Have a good night, guys.